My name is Captain Damolk, 3rd Aggressor Army, member Circle Trigon Party. I am sure that you of the television audience are completely unaware of this. But listen, these are the facts. Ever since the fall of 1946, the American Army has been at war with the forces of the Circle Trigon Party. Now, during this decade, large areas of the continental United States have been liberated by our forces. Because we have been so successful, you, of course, have been kept from the facts.
Confused? Surprised? That's totally understandable, so let's dive into the Aggressor Nation and the Circle Trigon Party. It's mid-1945. Germany has surrendered and much of Europe has begun picking up the pieces and rebuilding. However, disagreements and infighting rose among the Allied powers and the United Nations, leading to a massive withdrawal of forces, leaving something of a power vacuum in many areas of the continent. Using the situation as well as the overall discontent of many, a small faction of individuals were successful in getting a handful of its members from their Circle Trigon Party into office after a general election later that year. In only a matter of days, however, they were able to use this small wedge in the central government to achieve total control over the region, and through the winter into 1946 managed to consolidate and solidify power through propaganda, claiming they're fighting for democracy and the people, while also reining in the armed forces, restructuring police loyal to them, while also heavily influencing many other facets of life, from education, the arts, industry, commerce, science, and the media. A somewhat mysterious centralized leadership system would form, seeing individuals from assorted backgrounds and skill sets, with the upper and main entity being the Trinity, made up of 3 men. It initially comprised of one who hailed from the Franco-Italian region of Europe, another with a Spanish and Arabic background, and a third who represented Germanic and Teutonic descended people. This last one was actually Martin Bormann, Adolf Hitler's personal secretary and even the Nazi Party head in the closing days of the war, who managed to evade capture and disappeared. This triangle of power, or trigon, would be reinforced by their rather simple symbol, the Circle Trigon, or a green triangle within a white circle, which would appear on propaganda, paperwork and documents, emblems and insignia, and even their flag. In the opening months, this new government, which would eventually become known as the Aggressor Nation or Aggressor Republic, was seen by the US, UK, and USSR as a benefit, as they were essentially doing the job none of them wanted to do. As a result, they provided support to them for a time, as they saw the Trigonists as a way of creating peace throughout the continent. This was true, but through the remainder of the decade, using various levels of coercion by way of political, ethnic, and nationalistic means, the nation expanded its territory throughout portions of southern, central, and western Europe, along with areas of even North Africa, leading to an influx of numerous ethnicities, nationalities, and beliefs, resulting in Esperanto becoming their official language. However, soon after, their ideologies and politics shifted towards militarism and totalitarianism, resulting in the party more or less instituting an open call to arms to any and all to join them, leading to a massive influx of former service members from both Axis and Allied powers alike, bolstering their military size into the hundreds of thousands. But even as all this was happening, the central power of the Trigon Party realized that the United States would eventually become their primary enemy in all facets. And so, even before taking over much of Europe, implemented a first strike coming in November of 1946, taking control of many of the Antilles Islands in the Caribbean, as well as the Panama Canal, which was used as a way to launch a surprise attack in California, resulting in them claiming a beachhead. Early and small to medium-scale fighting would continue into 1947 in Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas by way of the Atlantic, as well as portions of Quebec, northeastern Canada, New England, and New York by way of the St. Lawrence River. 1948 saw sympathizers backed by them rise up in Tennessee and Kentucky. 1949 saw continued fighting in the Caribbean, primarily Puerto Rico, a second offensive in the Carolinas, and attacks on Hawaii and the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. Into the 1950s through the 60s and even the early 1970s, more engagements would be seen throughout North America in many of the same places, and new ones such as Texas and the Gulf Coast, the Pacific Northwest, Virginia, and the Mid-Eastern region, along with ones in Southeast Asia and Western Europe. Terrains, combats, and units of all shapes, sizes, and styles would be seen from cold and mountainous, warm and forested, and hot and barren, to occupation, liberation, all-out ground warfare, infiltration, and so on, with units and weapons ranging from basic infantry, amphibious, arctic, airborne, armored, chemical, and even nuclear being employed. During this time, the forces of the Aggressor Republic utilized a number of weapons and uniforms, many of which greatly mirrored features of the United States', though also had elements from other foreign forces such as the Soviet Union, all of which kept pace with advancing technologies. Eventually, after 1973 or so, though, the Circle Trigon Party and the Aggressor Nation fell apart as quickly as it had risen, with their army disbanding and their territory and lands throughout the Americas and Caribbean becoming liberated and its control over much of Europe dissipating. Sounds pretty wild, right? Something out of a Philip K. Dick novel or Command and Conquer video game, and honestly, yeah, it was. This whole story was concocted by the United States military as a long-term training scenario, with the enemy force being a very well fleshed out entity known simply as the Aggressor Forces. Conceptualized by a board of officers after World War II as a way to provide U.S. forces a more grounded and potentially realistic depiction of an enemy rather than simple blue versus red type training, it was then directed into being by General Dwight D. Eisenhower and initiated in late 1946. Though not the first instance of troops playing hypothetical enemies in scenarios, it was the first large-scale and fully developed one being stationed out of Fort Riley in Kansas, and was even the predecessor to the U.S.'s modern-day OP-4 or opposing forces. The idea behind it was to essentially blend elements, factors, and experiences of World War II, like the whole Martin Bormann being one of the three leaders, as after the war he eluded capture and virtually disappeared until remains were verified to be his in 1973, along with the rising threat of communism, specifically the Soviet Union, and blend it all into one big bad totalitarian entity known as the Circle Trigon Party. Having it manifest out of a war-weary Europe using ideology, propaganda, and political subversion and upheaval had the roots in many regions of the continent between the First and Second World War, with it taking specific examples straight out of Germany, Italy, and Spain. Throw in a little bit of expansionist and exporting ideologies that the Soviet Union began even before World War II ended, and it drove home what the West could potentially face moving into the post-war years. As far as fighting went, many of the hypothetical scenarios and engagements, be they just on paper or actual real-world training scenarios, involved vulnerable, critical, and/or highly valuable locations that could potentially see real warfare, notably the Caribbean and Southeast Asia, both of which were actually in a way foretelling of things to come, the Panama Canal Zone, which remained vital for U.S. interests, Hawaii and the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, both of which were attacked and even in later cases occupied by Japan during World War II, and even Western Europe, which at that point was one of the locations war could break out if the Cold War ever went hot. On top of all this, extensive backgrounds and history spelled out, quite literally in the form of assorted manuals, the inner workings of the Aggressor Nation, from politics and government to industry and the economy, as well as religion and culture, to help establish the fictional force as something that could be a real thing. So you get the idea. It was essentially a real-world, long-term LARPing event, as many have put it bluntly in the decades after its replacement, that helped train soldiers for potential future real-world situations and combat, while also teaching soldiers and those involved the ideals and beliefs of a foreign enemy that the U.S. could very well face. Now, there's obviously a whole made-up history, military structure, and so on of the Circle Trigonists, as well as their fictional war with the United States, with a lot of engagements made up entirely and only being seen on paper between 1946 and roughly 1973. But there were obviously quite a few real-world training scenarios that received their own proper exercise or operational names. Some include Exercise Miki in 1949, held in Hawaii, that saw Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine forces attempt to retake controlled portions of Oahu, Operation Porto on the island of Vieques in Puerto Rico in 1950, which trained troops for amphibious and airborne assaults. 1952 saw a few such as Exercise Snowfall in upstate New York, which focused on airborne and cold weather operations, along with it being the first maneuver to use simulated tactical nuclear weapons, as well as Operation Longhorn that focused on a large-scale invasion and occupation that involved over 115,000, only to be knocked to second place by Operation Sagebrush in 1955, which was another fictional battle held in Louisiana that aimed to train soldiers for the Atomic Age that saw over 155,000 participate, and Operation Goldfire 1 in 1964, held in and around Tennessee to test the then newly developed Joint Air Force-Army tactical methods. Many of these saw much more extensive elements such as civilian involvement, detainment, interrogations, inflatable vehicles and equipment, collaborators, guerrillas, infiltrators and partisans, sonic platoons whose duties were to provide sound effects of battle and PA systems for nearby towns, the dropping and disbursement of assorted propaganda such as leaflets, live broadcasts, signs, posters, staged pyrotechnics and events, occupational currency, and an ever-evolving arsenal for aggressor forces that kept pace with real-world technological development, among many others. Now, obviously, there were plenty more on smaller scales or set up slightly differently and not quite fitting into the Trigon storyline directly, but you see a trend here. Being as the simulated war waged for nearly 30 years, a lot changed over the time for both the US and Aggressor armies, and though both more or less used the same weapons, to some extent, their uniforms were slightly different. Much like early training and small-scale war games, Aggressor forces saw a look consisting of modified US uniforms, with the primary difference being their color dyed to a dark green, referred to as jungle green in some documents of the time. As the 1950s were progressing, the US Army was slowly changing their uniforms and gear by way of updating older ones or replacing them, with the biggest change coming in the form of the M1951 uniform system, which was more or less an updated version of the M1943 that had been introduced towards the end of World War II, as well as the more general use utility uniform often referred to as OG 107s due to their olive green 107 shade, first appearing in 1952. This meant older uniforms were slowly being phased out and replaced, meaning they could be more universally allocated, with some of the more common being the series of khaki cotton twill uniforms, usually worn for warmer months or locations, and wool service uniforms for colder. Both had been worn through the 1930s, 40s, and into the 50s. Simply dyed green and supplemented with quick makeshift things such as small forms of insignia, different hats and headwear, which we'll get to shortly, and so on were added. Though not always the case, as it depended on the exercise or operation, unit, and locations, other garments were seen such as HBTs, the more recently introduced M1951s and utilities, and even more crude items such as makeshift smocks that appeared almost like potato sacks. As time progressed, these Aggressor uniforms became more uniform, while also boasting more structured and established ranks, insignia, and patches, while the darker green color gave them a more intimidating look while differing them from US forces, especially in black and white newsreels, footage, and even movies of the time, with one prime example being the 1952 comedy Jumping Jacks starring Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin, which sees a rather large war game occur towards the end of the film, showing off these uniforms in great detail. Constantly evolving and being improved, more specific and specialty corps, units, ranks, and even medals began being established and laid out in manuals for forces that slowly started appearing on certain uniforms. When it came to headwear, the policy of altering existing uniform pieces continued, though again were a bit specialized, seeing more common jungle green pieces such as side or garrison caps being dyed that color, with later on in some instances especially made ones. Other colors were seen too, such as black for armored and reconnaissance units, red for elite units, and black berets for select special forces. These would also be supplemented with other soft hats such as M1937s with the addition of a flash patch or some sort of insignia to differentiate them from US troops. As for helmets, the take was a bit more unique through the modification of the M1, or rather the M1 liner, by way of adding a small curved wooden piece, sometimes called a comb but often referred to as the ridge, to the top. Initially, these were to be made by individuals or units playing Aggressor forces, with manuals and other related documents stating how to create them, which resulted in the combs, sometimes varying in dimensions and attachment methods, usually being glue or screws, both of which essentially ruined the serviceability of the liners afterwards. To prevent this, a change came in 1953 by way of a Department of the Army Quartermaster Corps Modification Work Order, titled Conversion of Liner Helmet M1 to Make Aggressor Forces Combat Headgear. It laid out a modification method that granted authorized personnel to add two small open rivets which allowed for a ridge adapter, pretty much a metal wire that would rest into a central groove on the ridge and then hook into the two, allowing for easy on and off. At some point after, this concept was taken a step further, with full fiberglass and other lightweight shells being made with a built-in ridge, though these were much less seen, though did lead to further Aggressor and eventual OPFOR lightweight shells appearing through the late 1970s and into the 80s, leaning more towards Soviet SSH designs. But they didn't stop at unique headwear, as in the early 1960s, 1962 based on affiliated tags, an exclusive and fully designed Aggressor uniform was created and began being issued. Unique for a few reasons, the core elements of the uniform broke down into four pieces, so let's start with the outer layer by way of the coat man's cotton wind-resistant sateen green Army shade 255. Seeing two primary versions, one that had all the same details as the standard M1951 field jacket, minus the usage of 4 exposed buttons on the front pockets, and one that appeared much closer to the M1965 field jacket, that retained elements of the M1951, such as outward-facing adjustment cords, button cuffs, and the continued usage of a detachable hood. These hoods were actually the second component, and though featured all the same tags and elements as their standard issue counterparts, have nomenclature that state them as Aggressor. This particular set is obviously mismatched, as the hood was found as new dead stock in unissued condition, while the coat has seen better days. It also kind of reeks of cigarettes. Moving now to the trousers, they were similar to the coats in that they appeared to be just recolored issue pieces. However, looking closer, it is obviously they are something of a hybrid design, pulling features from at least 2 but possibly 3 different trousers. Denoted as Trousers Aggressor CTN Sateen Green Shade 255 on the smaller waist, and trousers men's Aggressor Green 255 on the larger back pocket tag, this style is unique as at first glance they appear almost identical to US OG 107s, aka the utility uniforms, which were used by the US from the 1950s through the 1980s, granted with a few changes seen, mostly to the tops, as they feature the immediately noticeable two large waist patch pockets, as well as the dual rear ones too, which were slightly different as they lack cover flaps. But many of the other features are straight from the M1951 field trousers, those being the waist tab adjusters, internal adjuster drawstrings at the bottom of each leg, and waist loop bands for suspenders, but strangely only have two on the front with none on the back. Finally, and perhaps most interestingly, was their almost comically long 6-button fly that went all the way down to the bottom of the front waist pocket sections. All of this together technically makes them their own style, which appeared to have really only been made and used for aggressor forces. However, the final major piece was an entirely unique item, at least when it came to US uniforms. Officially, the shirt man's Aggressor Green 255 looked to have been produced only in general sizes such as small, medium, and large, as the cut of them were loose pullovers made to mimic Soviet-style gymnastiorka tunics. Though these types of garments had been fielded by Russian forces since 1870 in one way, shape, or form, they became pretty significant and really synonymous with Russian communist-affiliated forces, and eventually the Soviet Union as a whole, thanks in part to the Russian Civil War, but really the M35 uniform, which began being fielded during the late 1930s, seeing slight modifications and continued usage through World War II alongside the M43 version, which saw lifted collars. Seeing as the gymnastiorka was one of the most standard field uniforms of the Red Army until 1946, and then Soviet ground forces from 1946 until the introduction of the M69 uniform around 1969, it made sense that the garments of the heavily Soviet-influenced Circle Trigon aggressor forces were partially based on them as well. But let's dive into it in a bit more detail. The shirts bore a half-front closure which were secured by 3 buttons. There were 2 chest pockets seeing exposed buttons as well as more intricate curved pointed flaps, which was also lifted from many versions fielded by Soviet forces. Along the waist were loops for an adjustable belt, used obviously to adjust it to wearer sizes. Because this belt wasn't directly connected to the shirt, many surviving pieces nowadays often lack them. The sleeve cuffs didn't have any kind of adjustment method, again playing to the semi-universal sizing, and most interestingly, the inclusion of shoulder tabs as well as 2 large black grommets on either side of the collar. These 2 features were used to denote rank and service type, with the rank tabs being slid onto the shoulder boards while the grommets made for easy on and off of the specially made collar tabs that use small snap buttons. They would simply be unbuttoned, slid over, lined up, and snapped shut, securing them to the shirt. Due to the extensive nature of the Circle Trigon forces, there were numerous ranks and colors for different services, and interestingly, many of them came in specially issued packs so those playing the aggressor could easily switch between corps, units, and so on. These tabs came in pairs, obviously, with each color having a production tag inside stating their official designation as tabs, collar, aggressor, shirt, cotton, sateen, as well as contract numbers, and each color having a unique federal stock number. Color-wise, they use red for rifle units, white for artillery, yellow for tank and mechanized cavalry, light blue for airborne, black for engineer, tan for signal, purple for chemical warfare, orange for propaganda, and blue for most other services. As for ranks, they both saw commissioned and enlisted, which similarly followed, at least for a time, the same differences as actual Army ones. That is, chevrons for enlisted, which were often inverted and worn lower down the arms, and bars for officers. When it came to shoulder boards, though, ranks were mostly denoted by repurposed service stripes and overseas service bars. Some examples of these uniforms, as well as many others though, also saw other assorted repurposed patches and flair, likely added by individuals or units for various reasons. By the mid to late 1960s, the war in Vietnam was scaling up while the Circle Trigon Party story and aggressor forces began to stagnate and fall into a state of disuse, at least compared to the decade prior. Resources, training, and of course manpower begin to focus on the war, with war games and fictional scenarios being seen on much smaller, more localized scales as opposed to the grand exercises that saw tens of thousands participate. Though Aggressor employed and focused on large forces revolving around totalitarianism and ideals that pulled from fascism and communism, with later updated doctrines leaning and being based mostly on Soviet ones, it only slightly touched on elements that the US Army had faced during its time in Southeast Asia, and instead tried to prepare soldiers for more conventional conflict with formal standing armies, clear lines, and obvious enemies. Additionally, many saw it as fun and games, leaning more towards the theatrical and being an opportunity to essentially goof off. With the excessive amounts of lore and information about the Trigonists, many portraying them disregarded the doctrines and role-playing element, often opting instead for established US tactics when fighting against US forces. On top of this, the tactics, information, and doctrines that were supposed to be followed and employed by aggressors were pretty dated and often presented in long-form manuals which ranged from around 100 to upwards of 350 pages, which naturally likely had the average soldier reacts something like this.
Whoa! I'm not reading that crap! Summarize it in one word!
Anyway though, as the 1970s hit, the war was winding down and the United States had encountered and learned a lot. New tactics, new combat, new types of enemy forces, and overall new warfare. Realizing moving forward the Army would have to once again prepare and train for new and evolving forms of combat and enemy forces, the Army Chief of Staff General William Westmoreland wrote in 1972, "In the past, Aggressor was employed to satisfy this requirement. With appropriate modification, it can do so again." This was followed up with the call to revamp Aggressor literature, manuals, doctrine, and pretty much everything else to meet these requirements, which was first taken up by the G2 Intelligence and G3 Operations and Training Directorates of the 101st Airborne Division. This came in the form of taking the 1966 Aggressor Field Manuals, as many of the ones seen after had little updating, and building on and altering them while creating an AAT, or Aggressor Advisory Team, made up of a handful of officers and NCOs who formulated specific scenarios, training, and even uniforms to better fit specific trainings and wargames. On top of this, actual trained soldiers specializing in things like interrogations, counterintelligence, and so on both participated and oversaw exercises. Using uniforms that were scrounged and a bit more on the makeshift side, this new angle involving and being run by specialists who had first-hand experience in many tasks caught on among the division, proving to be very successful, and in less than a year became an official branch of the G2's training section. With the 1970s moving forward, this revised Aggressor system began being eyed by other soldiers outside the division, and by 1976, a new program had become official by way of Army Regulation 350-2, formally creating the OPFOR, or Opposing Forces program. Through the rest of the decade and into the early 1980s, it slowly took shape, seeing new and updated manuals and training material published, designated training locations such as the National Training Center created at Fort Irwin in California, a focus on more direct Soviet stand-in units sometimes bearing new and entirely unique uniforms, which again were a mix of repurposed and specially made ones, but were all obviously Soviet-based as they frequently included blatant symbolism and insignia, as well as actual tactics, though these forces were often referred to as Krasnovians, and dedicated units whose primary purpose was to play opposing forces long-term. This, along with smaller-scale war games held throughout the country and even abroad, which centered around more modern threats, tactics, and so on, which also kept up with evolving warfare and scenarios while also often utilizing fictional locations, nations, and forces, essentially blended elements of Aggressor and new, more effective training methods, becoming what the US OPFOR is today. But that more or less is the story of the Circle Trigon Party and the Aggressor Nation. There's plenty of documents, manuals, articles, and so on that you can find online for free if you want to learn more about them, with the three most common manuals being FM 30-101, Aggressor, the Maneuver Enemy, which also had 101-1 that covers Esperanto, 30-102, Handbook on Aggressor Military Forces, and 30-103, Aggressor Order of Battle. There's also quite a bit of ephemera and other related items such as Know Your Enemy pamphlets, faux propaganda, articles from 1950s Army Information Digest and other magazines, and even Army-released episodes of The Big Picture, a television show that ran from the 1950s to the 60s. As for uniforms, they often still do appear online from time to time, with the specially made Aggressor 255 green ones frequently fetching quite a bit, while more makeshift ones can fluctuate in price. But hopefully this abridged history and look at Aggressor forces and their uniforms was interesting and enjoyable. Obviously there is a whole lot more when it comes to opposing forces uniforms, which will certainly be covered a little ways down the line. But until then, if you like this one, perhaps leave a like and subscribe for more. If not, that's fine, just be sure to maneuver on back soon for more the history of right here in Uniform History.